My name is Sharon Hayes, and at 32, I thought I understood my family better than anyone. Growing up as the middle child between my older sister, Carol Allen Hayes, and younger brother, Quinton Hayes, I'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over arguments and kept everyone connected. Our family had weathered plenty of storms together. Dad's job loss when I was 15, Mom's breast cancer scare 3 years ago, and countless smaller crises that seemed monumental at the time. But nothing had prepared me for what was coming. It started with small things that didn't quite add up. Carol's husband, David Allen, had always been the golden boy of our family gatherings. When Carol married him 5 years ago, we all welcomed him with open arms. He was charming, successful in his accounting firm, and seemed genuinely devoted to my sister. More importantly, he'd stepped into our family traditions seamlessly, never missing a birthday dinner, always bringing thoughtful gifts, and treating our parents like his own. The first crack in that perfect image appeared during Mom's 65th birthday party last spring. David had volunteered to handle the restaurant reservation, something he'd done flawlessly for years. But when we arrived at Romano's that evening, there was no reservation. The hostess looked at us with polite confusion, while David fumbled with his phone, claiming he'd called weeks ago. We ended up at a chain restaurant down the street, the celebration feeling deflated despite our attempts to salvage it. "These things happen," Mom said later, ever the diplomat. But I caught the disappointment in her eyes as she looked at the generic birthday cake from the grocery store bakery instead of the custom one Romano's always made for family celebrations. Then there were the missed calls. David had always been reliable about staying in touch, especially with Dad, who'd grown fond of their weekly conversations about sports and current events. But those calls became sporadic, then stopped altogether. When Dad mentioned it during our monthly family dinner, David brushed it off with a laugh. "Just been swamped at work, you know how it is during tax season," he said, though it was already June. Carol jumped to his defense immediately. "David's been working so hard lately. The firm is expanding, and he's up for partner." I wanted to believe it was that simple, but something felt off. David seemed distracted during family gatherings, checking his phone constantly, and stepping outside for mysterious calls. When I tried to engage him in conversation, his responses felt rehearsed, like he was going through the motions of being the devoted son-in-law we'd all grown to love. The real warning sign came during Dad's routine doctor visit in late summer. At 70, Dad was still sharp and independent, but his arthritis had been worsening, making simple tasks increasingly difficult. The doctor recommended he start using a walker, and suggested we consider arranging some daily assistance for household tasks. "It's just temporary," Dad insisted when he called to tell us about the appointment, "just until this flare-up settles down." But I could hear the worry in his voice, the fear of becoming a burden that he'd never admit out loud. Our family had always prided itself on taking care of our own, and I knew this transition would be challenging for everyone. That evening, Carol called a family meeting. We gathered in Mom and Dad's living room, the same space where we'd celebrated countless holidays and weathered every family crisis. David sat beside Carol on the old floral couch, his arm around her shoulders in what should have been a gesture of support. "We need to talk about how we're going to handle Dad's care," Carol began, her voice steady but strained. "The doctor says he'll need daily check-ins, help with grocery shopping, maybe some light housekeeping." Quinton nodded immediately. "I can take mornings before work, and weekends are no problem." "I'll handle afternoons," I added. "My schedule's flexible enough to stop by every day after lunch." We all looked at Carol and David expectantly. They lived closest to our parents, just 15 minutes away compared to Quinton's 30-minute commute and my 25-minute drive. It would make sense for them to take the evening shift or coordinate the weekend coverage. But David shifted uncomfortably, his arm dropping from Carol's shoulders. "Well, we'll have to see what we can manage," he said vaguely. "Like I mentioned, work's been really demanding lately." Carol's face flushed slightly. "What David means is that we'll absolutely help, but we might need to be creative about scheduling." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Mom's antique clock on the mantel. Something cold settled in my stomach as I watched David avoid eye contact with everyone, his gaze fixed on his hands folded in his lap. That night, as I drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was standing on the edge of something that would change everything. The man who had once insisted on hosting every holiday, who remembered everyone's favorite desserts and never missed sending anniversary cards, seemed to be pulling away just when we needed him most. I had no idea how right I was or how much worse things were about to get. The next few weeks revealed just how deep David's commitment to our family had once run. As I took on my daily visits with Dad, memories of David's unwavering support flooded back, making his current distance even more painful. 3 years ago, when Mom had her first heart attack, David had been the one to coordinate everything. He'd created a detailed schedule for hospital visits, arranged for meal deliveries, and even researched the best cardiac specialists in the state. When the insurance company initially denied coverage for Mom's procedure, David had spent hours on the phone, navigating bureaucratic maze after maze until he got them to approve it. David's like the son we never had, Dad had told me then, his voice thick with gratitude. I don't know what we'd do without him. During Mom's recovery, David had installed grab bars in their bathroom, rearranged furniture to create clear pathways, and researched heart-healthy recipes that he'd cook and freeze in individual portions. He'd even convinced his boss to let him work from home 2 days a week so he could be nearby if Mom needed anything. When Carol had struggled with postpartum depression after their second child, David had somehow managed to care for both kids while ensuring Carol got the help she needed, all while maintaining his support for our parents. He'd been the family's rock, the one person we could always count on to show up. That's why his current behavior felt like such a betrayal of everything he'd once stood for. The first real sign of trouble came during Dad's second week home from the hospital. I'd arrived for my usual afternoon check-in to find Dad sitting in his recliner, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. The breakfast dishes were still on the kitchen table, and his morning medications sat untouched in their weekly dispenser. Dad, did someone come by this morning? I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. He looked confused for a moment. David was supposed to stop by before work, but he trailed off, staring out the window. Maybe I missed him. These pain medications make everything fuzzy. I checked my phone. It was already 2:30 in the afternoon. If David had come by, it would have been before 8 a.m. for his work schedule. Dad would have been awake. He'd been an early riser his entire life. When I called David that evening, his explanation was smooth but unconvincing. Sorry, Sharon. I got called into an emergency meeting first thing this morning. I tried calling the house, but no one answered. Dad's been having trouble hearing the phone ring from upstairs, I explained. That's why we arranged for in-person check-ins. Right, of course. It won't happen again. But it did happen again. And again. Quinton started noticing the pattern too. I've been arriving from my morning shift to find Dad hasn't taken his evening medications, he told me during one of our coordination calls. When I ask him about it, he says David never showed up the night before. We decided to create a shared calendar where each of us would check in after completing our shifts. The pattern that emerged was devastating. David's check-ins became increasingly sporadic, then virtually non-existent. When confronted, he always had an excuse: work emergencies, car trouble, feeling under the weather, and not wanting to risk getting Dad sick. The breaking point came 3 weeks after Dad's discharge. I arrived for my afternoon visit to find Dad on the kitchen floor, conscious but unable to get up. He'd fallen while trying to reach a glass from a high cabinet, something David was supposed to have reorganized during his evening visits. How long have you been here, Dad? I asked, helping him to his feet and checking for injuries. Since this morning, he admitted quietly. I was trying to get some water with my medication. My heart broke. Dad had been lying on that cold kitchen floor for hours, too proud to call for help, waiting for someone to find him. The glass of water he'd been reaching for was for medications that should have been taken with breakfast, medications that David was supposed to help him organize and remember. That evening, I called an emergency family meeting. Carol arrived looking defensive before I'd even started talking. Before you say anything, she began, David's been dealing with a lot at work. His company is going through layoffs, and he's been putting in 12-hour days trying to keep his job. Carol, Dad was on the floor for 6 hours today, I said quietly. 6 hours. Because David hasn't been showing up for his shifts, and Dad was trying to do things he's not supposed to be doing alone yet. Quinton leaned forward in his chair. I've been tracking the check-ins. David's missed 8 out of the last 10 scheduled visits. 8, Carol. Carol's face crumpled slightly, but she rallied quickly. You don't understand the pressure he's under. This job is our family's livelihood. If he loses it, if Dad gets seriously hurt because no one's checking on him, what then? I interrupted. What if he'd hit his head when he fell? What if he'd broken a hip? The room fell silent. Carol stared at her hands, and for a moment I thought we were getting through to her. Then she looked up, her expression hardening. Maybe we need to consider other options, she said carefully. There are assisted living facilities that specialize in post-surgical care. Dad might be safer. No, Quinton's voice was sharp. We committed to keeping Dad at home. All of us. That was the plan we all agreed to. Plans change, Carol said, her voice rising slightly. Circumstances change. David can't sacrifice his career for this. But Quinton and I can sacrifice our time and energy, I asked, feeling anger building in my chest. We've been covering David's shifts on top of our own. I've rearranged my entire work schedule. Quinton's been getting up at 5 a.m. every day to make sure Dad's okay before his own job. Carol stood up abruptly. I think we all need to cool down and approach this more rationally. David and I will discuss what we can realistically commit to, and we'll get back to you. After she left, Quinton and I sat in stunned silence. The brother-in-law who had once moved heaven and earth for our family was now treating Dad's care like an inconvenient obligation to be managed or delegated away. Something's not right, Quinton said finally. This isn't the David we know. Even if work is stressful, he wouldn't just abandon Dad like this. I nodded, but a terrible suspicion was forming in my mind. Unless he's already decided that Dad isn't his responsibility anymore. The next morning, I arrived early for my shift and found Quinton's car still in the driveway. Inside, I discovered him helping Dad with breakfast, his face grim. David never showed up last night, Quinton said without preamble. Dad waited until 10 p.m., then gave up and went to bed without his evening medications. That's when I knew for certain. David hadn't just been missing shifts due to work stress or poor time management. He had made a deliberate choice to abandon our family when we needed him most. The man who had once been our greatest source of support had become our greatest source of betrayal, and somehow, he'd convinced Carol to enable his abandonment of the very people who had welcomed him as a son. The confrontation came 3 days later. I had spent those days documenting every missed shift, every excuse, every time David had failed to show up when Dad needed him. Quinton and I agreed we couldn't let this continue. Dad's health was deteriorating, and the stress of unreliable care was making everything worse. I called Carol and asked her to meet us at Dad's house for a family meeting. When she arrived with David, I could see the defensive posture in both of them before anyone even spoke. We need to address what's been happening, I began, my voice steady despite the anger churning in my stomach. David, you've missed 12 scheduled care shifts in the past 3 weeks. Dad went without his evening medications twice because no one showed up. David shifted uncomfortably. Sharon, I've explained that work has been incredibly demanding. I'm trying to balance everything, but... No, I interrupted. This isn't about balance anymore. This is about abandonment. You committed to being part of Dad's care team, and now you're treating it like an optional activity. Carol stepped forward. That's not fair. David has been under enormous pressure at work. His supervisor has made it clear that missing any more time could jeopardize his position. And what about Dad's position? Quinton asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. What about his health, his safety, his dignity? We all have jobs, Carol. We all have responsibilities. But we made a commitment to keep Dad at home, and that means showing up. David finally spoke up, and his words confirmed my worst fears. Look, maybe we need to be realistic here. This level of care is beyond what we can provide long-term. Professional facilities exist for a reason. The room fell silent. In that moment, I realized that David had already mentally checked out of our family. The man who had once driven through a blizzard to help Dad fix a broken furnace was now suggesting we ship him off to a facility because showing up 3 times a week was too inconvenient. So that's it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. After everything our family has done for you, after Dad treated you like his own son, you're just walking away? It's not walking away, Carol said quickly. It's being practical. David and I have discussed this extensively, and we think a care facility would provide more consistent, professional support. You've discussed this extensively. Quinton's voice was dangerous now. You've been planning to abandon Dad behind our backs? David's mask finally slipped. I never signed up for this level of commitment. When we agreed to help with Dad's care, I thought it would be temporary, maybe a few weeks. It's been months, and it's affecting every aspect of my life. Affecting your life? I stood up, trembling with rage. Dad raised Carol from the time she was 8 years old after Mom died. He walked her down the aisle at your wedding. He helped you buy your first house, co-signed your car loan when your credit wasn't good enough. And now, when he needs us most, you're worried about how it's affecting your life? Carol's face flushed red. That's different. Dad chose to help us then. This is different. How is it different? Quinton demanded. How is caring for the man who cared for all of us any different from him helping you when you needed it? The argument that followed was brutal. David accused us of being unrealistic about Dad's needs, of expecting too much from family members who had their own lives to live. Carol supported him, claiming we were being manipulative by bringing up past favors and family history. But the worst moment came when David said, maybe if Sharon and Quinton can't handle the responsibility, we should all step back and let professionals take over. That's when I realized the full scope of their betrayal. They weren't just abandoning their own commitments. They were trying to manipulate us into giving up too, so they wouldn't look like the only ones walking away. Get out, I said quietly. Sharon, Carol started. Get out of Dad's house. Both of you. If you can't honor your commitments to this family, then you're not welcome here. After they left, Quinton and I sat with Dad, who had heard enough of the argument to understand what was happening. The pain in his eyes was devastating. I'm sorry, he said softly. I never wanted to be a burden. You're not a burden, Dad, I said, taking his hand. You're our father, and we love you. Some people just don't understand what family means. Over the next week, I threw myself into finding solutions. I researched home health aid services, looked into respite care options, and reorganized our schedules to cover the gaps David's abandonment had created. Quinton stepped up even more, taking on additional shifts and helping coordinate Dad's medical appointments. But the emotional toll was enormous. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying years of family memories, trying to understand how the man who had once been so integral to our family could simply walk away when we needed him most. The breaking point came when Carol called to inform me that she and David had already researched assisted living facilities and wanted to schedule tours. She presented it as a helpful gesture, but I could hear the underlying message. They had already decided Dad's fate without consulting us. We found 3 facilities that specialize in post-surgical care, she said, her tone artificially bright. They have excellent reviews and full medical staff. It would take the pressure off everyone. The pressure off you, you mean, I replied. Because Quinton and I aren't giving up on Dad. Sharon, be reasonable. You can't maintain this level of care indefinitely. You're gonna burn out, and then what happens to Dad? What happens is that we figure it out, like families do. What happens is that we don't abandon the people we love when things get difficult. The conversation ended with Carol hanging up on me, but not before she delivered one final blow. David and I have decided we can't continue to be part of this arrangement. We'll visit Dad when we can, but we're not committing to any more scheduled care. There it was, the official abandonment. After months of missed shifts and broken promises, they were finally admitting what had been true all along. When our family needed them most, they had chosen to walk away. That night, as I helped Dad with his evening routine, I made a decision. If David and Carol wanted to abandon their responsibilities, that was their choice. But I wouldn't let their betrayal destroy what remained of our family. Quinton and I would find a way to care for Dad with dignity and love, even if it meant doing it without the people we had once trusted most. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty but peaceful. For the first time in months, there were no false promises, no unreliable commitments, no wondering if someone would show up. It was just us, the family members who understood what loyalty meant, taking care of each other the way we always had. 18 months later, I stood in the community center where our monthly support group met, watching as 12 people shared their stories of family caregiving betrayal. What had started as an informal gathering of 3 people had grown into something I never expected. a lifeline for families navigating the devastating reality of abandonment during their most vulnerable moments. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion, shared Margaret, a woman whose son had disappeared when her husband needed round-the-clock care after his stroke. It was realizing that the person I'd trusted most was capable of such cruelty. Nods of understanding rippled through the circle. These were people who understood the unique pain of family betrayal during medical crises. The shock of discovering that blood relations could simply vanish when inconvenience outweighed obligation. I created support networks for people recovering from family care betrayal, something I never imagined I'd need to do. But here we were, a community born from shared wounds and mutual understanding. Dad had passed peacefully 6 months ago, surrounded by the family members who had never wavered. Quinton and I had maintained his care routine until the end, supported by a network of friends and hired help that proved more reliable than the relatives who had abandoned us. His final weeks were filled with dignity, love, and the knowledge that he was cherished. Carol and David had attended the funeral, sitting in the back row like distant acquaintances rather than family. They approached me afterward with awkward condolences and vague offers to reconnect. But their words felt hollow. The damage was irreversible, not because I couldn't forgive, but because trust, once shattered so completely, couldn't be rebuilt on empty gestures. "How do you move forward?" asked James, a new member whose sister had abandoned their mother's care. "How do you stop feeling angry?" "You don't stop feeling angry," I replied honestly. "You learn to channel it into something meaningful. You protect yourself from future betrayals while helping others who've experienced the same pain." The group had become my unexpected purpose. Through online forums and local chapters, we'd connected hundreds of families dealing with similar situations. We shared resources, legal advice, and most importantly, the validation that their pain was real and their anger justified. Quinton had found his own path to healing through advocacy work, pushing for legislation that would hold family members legally accountable for abandoning elderly care commitments. His efforts had gained traction with several state representatives who recognized the growing crisis of elder abandonment. After the meeting, I drove home to the small apartment I'd moved into after selling Dad's house. The space was mine alone, peaceful, organized, and free from the chaos of broken promises and unreliable people. I'd learned to value solitude over the stress of maintaining relationships with those who had proven themselves unworthy of trust. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Thinking of you on Dad's birthday. Maybe we could have coffee soon." I deleted the message without responding. Some bridges, once burned, weren't meant to be rebuilt. Some silences were more valuable than forced conversations with people who had revealed their true character when it mattered most. The evening light filtered through my windows as I prepared dinner for one, a simple, satisfying routine that belonged entirely to me. There was no waiting for people who wouldn't show up, no managing the disappointment of broken commitments, no wondering if family members would honor their word. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is accepting that some people will always choose convenience over character, comfort over commitment. The pain of their betrayal had transformed into something stronger. The wisdom to recognize authentic loyalty and the courage to build a life surrounded only by those who had earned their place in it. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.